Hello and welcome to Breakfast for Pancakes. I'm your host, PK Sullivan. This video is the first in a monthly series that I'm starting that I'm calling the Grand BreAdventure. Bread making really seems to cause people anxiety. I know that I was intimidated by it for quite a while, but once I dove in, I found that bread making is actually really rewarding and can be some of the best fun you'll have in the kitchen. It tends to be long-term projects that develop, and once you get the final project, you really feel like you've accomplished something. Ultimately, I found that bread is actually pretty straightforward. Once you learn the basics and figure out how bread works and learn some of the lingo, it's actually really straightforward. Eventually, some types of bread do get much more complicated, and sourdough gets to be a long-term commitment because you have to maintain your starter. This series is going to start with a base recipe. It's going to be the same 4 ingredients down to the gram for multiple videos. Over the course of time, I'm going to adapt how I use those ingredients, keeping the measurements all the same, but kneading the bread differently, handling it differently, letting it rest, and baking it differently to produce different kinds of bread. Today, we're starting at its most basic, and we're going to use a minimum amount of equipment so you don't have to go out and buy anything new. Best of all, there's no need for a sourdough starter. When it comes down to it, bread is just 4 ingredients: flour, water, salt, and yeast. The exact measurements for this recipe are down below in the show description. You'll notice everything is listed in grams. That's the first lesson of learning to make bread. Measure everything by weight. Get yourself a scale and you will have a much better, more successful bread making adventure than you would if you were trying to do things by volumes. In general, cooking is a collision between art and science. Bread making is a form of cooking that skews pretty heavily towards the science. So in order to have the best results, weigh all of your ingredients. That's the last I'm going to hammer at home, but it's important. Weigh all of your ingredients. That's why I list everything in grams down below. Get a kitchen scale. It doesn't have to be fancy. It just needs to be able to measure in grams and go up to a few kilos. And with that, let's start our BreAdventure. Starting off our bread making, I have adapted a recipe that I found years ago and converted it to grams, tweaked the numbers until it was working every time exactly the way that I wanted it to. I view this recipe as having 3 general but distinct phases. 1, the starter. 2, the sponge. And 3, the dough. That's the template we're going to be following as we make bread throughout this series. Your first job as a bread maker is to start a very tiny farm. Cultivate a colony of yeast. Yeast are tiny microorganisms that are essential to making a leavened bread. So in many ways, you are creating your own yeast ranch. And this ranch is called your starter. Don't freak out. The word starter gets people all freaked out. Oh my God, is he talking about sourdough? I don't have time for that commitment. Chill. Yes, you can keep your starter rolling between batches of bread, but you don't need to. The way this recipe is built, assuming you're starting from scratch, you don't have anything, or you don't care to maintain a starter between batches. You can start from here, start from scratch, build a starter, use it to make 1 loaf of bread or dozens down the line. It's up to you. Okay, so what is a starter? A starter is a mix of water, flour, and yeast. The water and flour slurry acts both as the habitat and food source for the yeast. This allows the yeast to propagate and multiply. Basically, they're having a big old party and making lots of babies. That's exactly what you want to happen in your little yeast ranch. You want lots of yeast to form. Yeast does 2 things for your bread. First, it's going to give off carbon dioxide and leaven the bread. That's how bread rises. Yeast eat the starch in your flour, and that turns into carbon dioxide and other compounds. The carbon dioxide gets released as a gas and creates little pockets in your bread. The other byproduct of the yeast eating the starch is a set of flavor compounds. These create flavors in your final bread. Okay, so here's how you make your starter. From scratch, and you don't need to keep it, though I recommend you give it a shot. Start the starter by blooming the yeast. Measure out 225 grams of warm water, between 110 and 120 degrees Fahrenheit. This is warm enough to quickly activate the yeast, but not hot enough to scald them. Speaking of yeast, measure out 1 gram of active dry yeast and whisk it into the water. Set aside and measure out 120 grams of all-purpose flour. Let everything stand for 10 minutes. This will give the yeast time to hydrate and wake up. After 10 minutes, the yeast should be bubbling slightly. It's time to feed the herd. Whisk the flour into the water in batches. You don't want clumps of dry flour. The final consistency should be that of a very thin batter. Congratulations! You now have a bread starter, and your journey towards delicious homemade bread has begun. Cover this loosely with plastic wrap or a non-airtight lid. Let the starter sit at room temperature for at least 8 hours and up to 24. Like I said, your starter is a little yeast ranch. In the time you've let it sit, the yeast have started eating the flour and made millions of new yeast babies. This is exactly what you want. Don't sweat the timing of capturing your starter at the exact right time. Let it go, let it be. The important thing is when you move into the sponge, you want to have it be active and bubbly. As long as it's active and bubbly, you are good to go. The sponge is the second phase. That's where we are right now in the bread making process. This is where your ingredients will actually start to resemble a bread dough. You'll be adding more flour, water, and yeast in this phase. This time the proportions get flipped. The starter had more water than flour because you wanted it to be liquid and fairly easy to portion. This time we'll be adding more flour than water because we want to start bringing everything together so that the yeast can really start chowing down. This phase is also called the bulk fermentation. This is where the yeast is going to do the bulk of its work. It's going to create most of the carbon dioxide, continue multiplying, and really develop the flavor in your bread. But all in all, step 2, the sponge, is very similar to step 1, the starter. Here's how you do it. Uncover the starter and whisk it to loosen it up. Set aside and measure out 236 grams of warm water. Again, between 110 and 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Whisk in another gram of active dry yeast. This addition of yeast helps make the recipe foolproof for beginners. Once you've developed a strong starter over multiple batches of bread, you can skip this. For now, we add the yeast to make sure our bread gets a nice rise. In a separate bowl, measure out 150 grams of your starter. Whisk that into the warm water as well. Now measure 340 grams of bread flour and mix that into the water, yeast, and starter mix. Don't use a whisk like I did. This quickly thickens up and the whisk gets clogged. Get a good spatula to mix it. It will quickly form a rough, sticky mass. Scrape down the sides as best you can so all the sponge is touching. Loosely cover the bowl and let it sit at room temperature for 4 to 12 hours. You'll notice we didn't use all the starter, and I even talked about developing a strong starter over multiple batches of bread. Don't throw out what you didn't use. Put it in a jar and stick it in the fridge. The cold will put the yeast into hibernation. The next time you want to make bread, you'll just need to feed your starter some water and flour rather than starting from scratch. I'll cover that in later BreAdventures. For now, save your starter. Fermentation is the chemical breakdown of a substance by yeast or other microorganisms. Typically, this gives off gas and other compounds. Those other compounds are what will add flavor to your final product. It's what gives beer and tea both their distinctive flavors. The 3 phases of this recipe correspond to different levels of fermentation. The starter is initial fermentation, where the purpose is to build a colony. The sponge is the bulk fermentation, where the yeast do most of their work and convert the starch into carbon dioxide and other flavoring compounds. In the final phase, the dough, the yeast is going to do the very important job of rising your final loaf. It does continue to develop flavor, but not as much as during bulk fermentation. As your bread bakes, the gases trapped inside are going to expand. This is called oven lift. It's what gives your bread its final shape and creates all the delicious, airy pockets inside of your bread, preventing it from just being hardtack. That said, we do need to rein in the yeast a little bit so that we don't end up with just a thin shell of perfectly crisp crust and nothing inside. To do that, you add salt. You see, yeast are kind of like us. They can't live off of salt water. So as you add salt to the bread and knead it in, it's going to kill off a bunch of the yeast. The remaining yeast are all you need to create the lift in your final bread. Salt does a lot of work though. It's not just about reining in the yeast. Salt really makes bread worth eating. Salt changes the flavor and makes bread taste better. I will be honest, I forgot to salt a couple of test loaves and they are very bland. Salt also improves the texture and color of the outside crust, and it somehow interacts with the gluten in the bread in order to improve the gluten lattice. It's really sort of a powerhouse ingredient in bread. Don't forget your salt. I mentioned gluten. I know that's a dirty word to a lot of people, but gluten is sort of the defining feature of this kind of bread. I've just been saying bread throughout the episode, when really I mean a wheat bread that is leavened with yeast. Gluten is what gives bread that distinctive, pullable, chewy, tender air pocket texture inside. That's called the crumb. Gluten is a collection of protein molecules found in wheat and a few other starches that, when hydrated, will form a latticework of interconnections that will hold together but stretch and expand, contract, and really be malleable and let you manipulate the bread while trapping air pockets inside, expanding when the gas expands during baking, and then as the outside shell firms up, it will hold that structure. This is what gives us the beautiful crumb inside our bread. That's the ultimate goal. All right, let's finish this bread off. Measure out 250 grams of bread flour and 7.5 grams of salt. Whisk together and add to the sponge. Fold together in a bowl until it's too unwieldy, then turn it out on your work surface and knead it together. Kneading bread is a simple process that's hard to explain. You want to move the dough and stretch it as it picks up all the loose flour. The trick is to expose the sticky dough to the new flour so it can get picked up. Doing this in a stand mixer is very simple and just a matter of letting it run for a few minutes with the dough hook. The next video of the series will show you how to use a stand mixer to bring the dough together. Doing it by hand honestly takes about the same amount of time, though it is more work. Stretch the dough out and push it around. You need to work in all of the new flour. I like to gather it in a ball and press down on it with the heel of my palm. This rolls the dough forward to pick up more flour and stretches the dough that I'm pushing on directly. If your dough is too wet, it will be sticky and hard to work with. Hopefully, that isn't the case. In the dozens of loaves I've made since I dialed in the weights, I haven't had a sticky dough once. However, if it is too wet and it's sticking to your work surface, measure out 65 grams of bread flour. You don't want to use any more than that. Sprinkle that on the work surface a tablespoon at a time and work it in. Stop adding flour as soon as the dough is no longer sticking to the counter. Once all the flour has been collected and you have a single, solid mass, you have a starting dough. First, the dough will be rough, ragged, stiff, and somewhat dry. That's called shaggy. As you work the dough, the new flour gets picked up and hydrated. The gluten starts to stretch and form a lattice. This changes the texture of the dough. It goes from being stiff and rough to supple and silky smooth. You can stop kneading when the dough is smooth and elastic, meaning it stretches and returns to shape. The whole kneading process took me about 7 minutes, from the time I turned the dough out onto the work surface until the time I had a smooth, elastic ball of dough. Lightly oil the inside of a bowl and add the dough, turning it once so there's a very fine coat of oil on the face-up side. Then cover the bowl with plastic wrap and let it rise for about an hour. It should double in size. While the dough rests, prepare a banneton. This is just a bowl lined with cloth that's been well floured. The flour on the cloth prevents the dough from sticking to it. A tightly woven kitchen towel or a large cloth napkin works just fine. Don't use terry cloth or heavily textured towels. Lay the towel out flat and sprinkle a few tablespoons of flour across it. Then spread the flour out with your hands, working it into the fabric. After the dough has doubled in size, gently poke it to deflate. This is called punching down the dough and makes it easier to work with. Turn it out onto your work surface and gently pull it toward yourself from the far edge. Make sure you don't lift the dough. You want the near side to stick slightly and pull the surface of the dough taut. The movement is only a few inches. Rotate the dough 90 degrees and repeat the pull. You want to do this 4 times total. This builds surface tension in the dough and helps improve the crust for this loaf. Now transfer the loaf to your banneton with the seam side up. The seams formed from the drag will be on the bottom of your loaf. We want them face up now, so when we turn out the bread one final time, they end up on the bottom. Loosely cover the banneton with plastic wrap. After the dough has proofed for an hour, get your oven prepared. Begin by loading your Dutch oven with the lid into the oven. Close the door and set the oven to 450 degrees. This will preheat for 1 hour as the bread does its final rise. Lay out a sheet of parchment paper. Remove the plastic wrap and sprinkle cornmeal or flour across the loaf. I prefer cornmeal. Then turn out the dough onto the parchment paper. The cornmeal is now on the bottom of the loaf. Baking the bread is going to expand the gases trapped in the dough, causing it to rise and expand. Those gases will need somewhere to go. If you don't make an outlet for them, your bread will rise according to its own whims. This is why many kinds of bread will have slashes in them, to guide the final shape of the loaf. Keep things simple. If you have a razor blade, use that. If you don't, a good sharp paring knife also does the trick. Be sure to hone it right before the slash. Aim to slash 1/2 inch to 1 inch deep. Move smoothly and with confidence in a single pulling motion. Now it's time to bake. Put on oven mitts and retrieve the Dutch oven. Remove the lid and set it aside, but keep it nearby. Pick up the loaf by the parchment paper and drop it in the Dutch oven. Now replace the lid and put the Dutch oven back in the oven and set a timer for 30 minutes. At the 30-minute mark, remove the lid from the Dutch oven. Continue cooking the bread for another 15 minutes. If you smell that the bread is toasting and getting too brown, remove it from the oven early. Remove the Dutch oven from the oven and use the parchment paper to lift your loaf. Set the bread on a wire cooling rack and be prepared to wait. It needs to cool fully before slicing, about 3 hours. You should only slice open a still warm loaf if you know it's going to be eaten all in one go. Sure, cutting open steamy loaves of bread is pretty on videos and makes all of us hungry, but the bread goes stale a lot faster if you cut it open too soon. This is a big loaf of bread. It's about 9 inches in diameter. It's great for grilled cheese or with fried eggs. I used most of this loaf for turkey sandwiches, but on camera, I just tried a few slices with salted Irish butter. So simple, so delicious. The loaf has a nice chewy crumb to it. The crust is substantial from all that time in the oven, but it also develops a lot of flavor in that oven. And that's the conclusion to part 1 of the BreAdventure. Next time, I'll show you how to shape the dough differently to end up with a completely different kind of bread. I'll see you then.